Today we have some more actual history about the early days of the American Republic. We will be reading about some of the wars with Indians on the western frontier of the United States that persisted into the 1790s. As this story will say, many of the Indians who took part with Great Britain during our Revolutionary struggle were unwilling to bury the tomahawk once peace was restored. This led to the worst defeats of the U.S. Army in history at the hands of Indians, and it took place during George Washington's first term in office. This defeat was larger than the fall of Custer. It was the defeat of Arthur St. Clair on November 4, 1791, in western Ohio, near the headwaters of the Wabash River. We will be hearing about St. Clair's defeat from a woman named Massie Harbison. Her husband was in St. Clair's army and was injured during the battle. We will be reading from this book, a narrative of the sufferings of Massy Harbison from Indian Barbarity, published by Massie Harbison all the way back in 1825. This episode is the first of a three-part series we will be doing from this book. This first episode will cover some of the first Indian attacks on the settlements in western Pennsylvania along the Allegheny River. These attacks led to the offensive operation against the Indians in Ohio led by General St. Clair, whose letters to Secretary of War Henry Knox are printed in this book in order to provide an account of the battle. In the second episode of this series, we will hear about Massie Harbison's Indian captivity in 1792. Then, in the third episode, we will hear about Mrs. Harbison's return to civilization, as well as General Wayne's decisive victory over these Indians in 1795. So here's the story of the Indian Wars in western Pennsylvania and Ohio in 1791. In consequence of the solicitations of a great number of my friends, who have been made acquainted with my sufferings from Indian barbarity, and in compliance with the request of many of those who were witnesses of the scenes here recorded, I have come to the determination of presenting a narrative of my sufferings, etc., before an enlightened and feeling public, being conscious they will sympathize with a woman who endured so many privations and trials in the first settlements of this now happy country, who feel grateful for the repose and felicity which they now enjoy, through the labor and privation of those who preceded them, and who most willingly patronize a poor widow, who is left to provide for her family through her own industry. I shall begin my narrative with a short account of my birth, parentage, removal to the western country, and marriage. I was born in Hamwell Township, Somerset County, New Jersey, on the 18th of March, 1770. In the days of my childhood, I was an eye and ear witness of some of those struggles which were endured for our independence and liberty. At the battles of Long Island, Trenton, and Monmouth, I heard the roaring of the cannon and the din of war. And when our revolutionary heroes were engaged in mortal combats with the enemies of our country at Westfield, I witnessed the bloody scene, for on that day I was at school near where the conflict took place, and upon the commencement of the battle we left the school, ascended an eminence, which commanded a view of the battlefield, where we could hear the word of command given by the officers, and see the movements of the troops until the smoke enveloped them. My father, whose name was Edward White, was a soldier of the Revolution. He was for 3 years during our revolutionary struggle contractor for the army, and was in every battle but that of Long Island. Animated by a love of liberty, and a hope of enjoying it, he engaged in this arduous struggle, and had the felicity of realizing the accomplishment of his desires, in the overthrow of our enemies. After the establishment of peace, my father and family moved from New Jersey to the western parts of Pennsylvania, on the Monongahela River to a place that was then called Redstone Fort, where Brownsville now stands. This took place in the year 1783, and in that place I lived with my father till the year 87, when I was married to John Harbison. My marriage incurred the displeasure of my father. 2 years elapsed while I lived near him. At last, finding that his displeasure did not abate, I moved with my husband to the banks of the Allegheny. We settled on the headwaters of Chartier's Creek, where from 1789 to 91 we did extremely well, and had a prospect of continuing to do well, but the breaking out of the Indian War in March of 91 blasted all our prospects, and the consequence of that war bereft us of all we possessed. So passes the fleeting enjoyments of the present life. The savages who had been persuaded to take a part with Great Britain during our struggle for independence were unwilling, when peace was restored, to bury the bloody tomahawk. They had not sufficiently bathed that murderous weapon in the blood of the Americans, hence they continued to exercise towards them the most wanton acts of barbarity, without the smallest pretext. It appears from the most indubitable testimony that from 1783, when peace was made, to October of 1790, when the United States commenced offensive operations against them, that on the Ohio and the frontiers, the Indians killed, wounded, and took prisoners about 1,500 men, women, and children, besides taking away 2,000 horses and a large quantity of their property. The particulars of many of the acts of barbarity, although supported by indisputable evidence, are of too shocking a nature to be presented to the public. These cruelties were inflicted upon prisoners of different ages and sexes, and it is sufficient here to observe that the scalping knife and tomahawk were the mildest instruments of death which were employed. In many cases, torture by fire and other execrable means were used. The inhabitants of the frontier on the banks of the Allegheny during the year 1790 enjoyed repose, though many inhuman acts of barbarity were perpetrated on the frontiers by the savages on the south side of the Ohio River, to detail which would be too tedious and disgusting, as well as swell the narrative beyond our intended limits. The first acts of Indian aggression and cruelty which took place on the banks of the Allegheny in 1791 was the attack which the savages made upon the house of Mr. Thomas Dick, living below the mouth of Deer Creek. This attack was made on the 18th of March 1791. Mr. Dick and his wife were made prisoners, and a young man who was living in the house with them was killed and scalped, and a considerable number of horses were stolen. Mr. Dick and his wife, though they were the subjects of those cruelties which were to be endured by those who were so miserable as to fall into the hands of these barbarians, yet had their lives spared them, and at the termination of 4 years, when peace was restored, through the victory which General Wayne obtained over the Indians, they obtained their liberty again, with nearly 400 more. On the night of the 22nd of March, 1791, that is 4 days after the preceding acts, 7 Indians came into the house of Mr. Abraham Russ, who lived about 2 miles above the mouth of Bull Creek, and 23 miles from Pittsburgh on the Allegheny River, in a friendly manner, leaving their rifles at the door, a well-known token of Indian friendship, and solicited their supper. Their request was complied with, and supper was procured for them, and they sat down and supped. When they had supped, one of the savages went and placed himself against the door, to prevent any of the family from escaping, while the rest, with their instruments of death, the tomahawks, began an indiscriminate murder of the inhabitants of the house, who had just treated them with so much hospitality. They succeeded in their diabolical project so far as to tomahawk and scalp 4 men, old Mrs. Russ, the mother of Mr. Russ, and 6 children, then plundered what they pleased from the house, bore away their plunder, and set fire to the house, and burnt the dead bodies with the buildings. Mrs. Derry, daughter of old Mrs. Russ, stood and endured the appalling and heartrending sight of an Indian taking her own child of 18 months old, and knocking its brains out against the head of her mother, by which means her mother was also killed. Thus, by one inhuman act of barbarity, she was deprived of a mother and a child. When she beheld this, she made to the door to attempt an escape herself. Then one of the Indians struck a blow at her head with his tomahawk, but she raised her left arm and averted the blow. She succeeded in getting to the door and in pulling it to pieces, being made only of clapboards, by which means she made her escape, and left an open passage for those who were able to follow her. 3 of her daughters then made their escape by following her. Mrs. Derry, sister-in-law to young Mrs. Russ, then made her escape, and 3 of her daughters with her. Agnes Clerk had the felicity of escaping with 2 children, and Catherine Cutright also escaped with them, having lost her husband and son. John Derry, a lad of 13 or 14 years of age, a son of Mr. Jacob Derry and Mrs. Derry, who was the proprietor of the house, but who was from home when this melancholy catastrophe took place, also escaped when he saw the manner of the Indians at supper, suspecting that all was not right, privately made his escape from the house and hid himself in a hollow tree, where he remained until the next morning, when he removed to a hole in some rocks on Little Bull Creek. In this situation he remained until the third day, when he was frightened from his retreat by the appearance of a wolf, and Jacob, a younger brother of 6 years of age, escaped from the house during the bloody conflict, and hid himself under a log, and covered himself over with leaves. While he was there secreted, the Indians repeatedly came upon the log, with fire in their hands, in quest of those who had escaped. But he was mercifully preserved by an overruling providence from falling a prey to their cruelty. The women and children who had escaped hastened to the river, when they called so as to be heard 1.5 miles away, and Levi Johnson, son-in-law to Mrs. Russ, ventured at the hazard of his life to cross the river in a canoe for them, by which means 17 persons were preserved from falling a prey to these monsters. The night was very frosty and severe, and those who had thus crossed the river had to run 9 miles, many of them nearly naked, without shoes on their feet, and through woods for a place of shelter. By the time they came to a place where they felt any way secure, Mrs. Derry was nearly exhausted with the loss of blood from the wound she had received in the face in forcing a passage out of the house. The tidings of this melancholy and heart-sickening event spread with great rapidity throughout the country. It was brought to me and to 7 or 8 families beside, within 1 mile of the Allegheny and Kiskiminitas, by messengers William Critchlow and Samuel Orr, about 11 o'clock that night. By this intelligence I was greatly alarmed and agitated for an hour, when we had packed up all we were able to carry with us and were ready to start. I then mounted on a horse with one child in my arms and another about 4 years old tied on behind me, to prevent him from falling off, and I was within 2 months of being confined with a third. We traveled about 7 miles to Mr. James Paul's on Pine Run, where we arrived about daybreak. By the time the sun rose, there were between 70 and 80 women and children collected to this retreat, and all the men, 4 excepted, had left us to pursue the Indians. The pursuers first went to the place where the awful massacre had taken place. There they found the smell which proceeded from the burning of the dead bodies to be so awfully offensive that they were scarcely able to endure it. From thence they proceeded 1 mile below the Kiskiminitas to the Allegheny, and erected a blockhouse where, in 2 weeks' time, all the families who had fled from our neighborhood returned, and remained during the summer. My husband, John Harbison, then enlisted in a 6-month service in a corps raised by Captain Guthrie, and proceeded to the Miami village, under the command of General St. Clair, and was in the fatal engagement in which the Indian savages so completely outgeneraled and defeated General St. Clair. My husband left me for this expedition at the above-mentioned blockhouse, which had received the name of Reed Station, with 3 helpless children, and came partially among strangers on the 3rd of August, and he did not return until the 24th of December, when he came home wounded. The wound he received in the battle on the 4th day of November, when General St. Clair was defeated. On the 6th of November, 2 days after the above engagements, the Indians attacked David McKee and another young man at a fish basket on the river 7 miles from the station, and most brutally massacred and scalped them. This was the last act of savage barbarity perpetrated on the banks of the Allegheny this season. So those were accounts of some of the Indian attacks on Massie Harbison's neighbors that occurred in 1791. That covers the first 2 chapters of her book. In Chapter 3, she prints General St. Clair's accounts of his campaign into western Ohio in the fall of 1791, and I will now read those accounts. Fort Washington, October 6, 1791. Sir, I now have the satisfaction to inform you that the Army moved from Fort Hamilton, the name I have given to the fort on the Miami, on the 4th of October at 8 in the morning, under the command of General Butler. The order of march and encampment I had regulated before, and on the 3rd returned to this place to get up the militia. They marched yesterday and consisted of about 300 men. As you will see by the enclosed abstract of the muster, I have reason to believe, however, that at least an equal number will be up here by the 10th, and I have left orders for their following us. The monthly return should have accompanied this letter, but it was not ready when I left camp, and has not been forwarded since. I have hitherto found it impossible to reduce the officers commanding corps to punctuality with respect to their returns, but they are mending. Our numbers after deducting the garrisons of this place and Fort Hamilton are about 2,000, exclusive of militia. I trust I shall find them sufficient, and should the rest of the militia come on, it would make the matter pretty certain. But the season is now so far advanced that I fear the intermediate post, which indeed would have been highly necessary, it will be impossible to establish. In that, however, I must be governed by circumstances, of which I shall take care that you shall be apprised in due time. Should the enemy come to meet us, which seems to be expected, and be discomfited, there will be no difficulties. But if they expect us at the Miami villages, the business will wear another face, and the intermediate posts become more essential. I am this moment setting out for the army which I hope to overtake tomorrow morning, and will write to you again as soon as may be. With great regard and respect, I have the honor to be, sir, your very humble servant, Arthur St. Clair. To the Honorable Major General Knox, Secretary of War, Camp 81 miles advanced of Fort Washington, November 1st, 1791. Sir, since I had the honor to write to you on the 21st last month, nothing very material has happened, and indeed I am at present so unwell, and have been so for some time past, that I could ill detail it if it had happened. Not that that space of time has been entirely barren of incidents, but as few of them have been of the agreeable kind, I beg you to accept a sort of journal account of them, which will be the easiest for me. On the 22nd of October, the indisposition that had hung about me for some time, something appearing as a bilious colic and sometimes as a rheumatic asthma, to my great satisfaction, changed to a gout in the left arm and hand, leaving the breast and stomach perfectly relieved, and the cough, which had been excessive, entirely gone. This day Mr. Ellis, with 60 militia from Kentucky, joined the army, and brought up a quantity of flour and beef. The 23rd of October, 2 men taken in the act of deserting to the enemy, and 1 for shooting another soldier, and threatening to kill an officer, were hanged up on the grand parade, the whole army being drawn out. Since the army has halted, the country around this and ahead for 15 miles has been well examined. It is a country which, had we arrived a month sooner in it, and with 3 times the number of animals, they would have been all fat now. The 24th of October, named the Fort Jefferson and marched, the same Indian path serving to conduct us about 6 miles, and encamped on good ground and in excellent position, a rivulet on front, and a very large prairie which would at the proper season afford forage for 1,000 horses on the left. I was so ill this day that I had much difficulty in keeping with the army. The 25th of October. Very hard rains last night, obliged to halt today on account of provisions. For though the soldiery may be kept pretty easy in camp under the expectations of provisions arriving, they cannot bear to march in advance, and take none along with them. Received a letter from Mr. Hodgson by express. 13,000 pounds of flour will arrive on the 27th. The 26th of October, a party of militia sent to reconnoiter fell in with 5 Indians, and suffered them to slip through their fingers in their camp. Articles to the value of $22 were found and divided. The Virginia battalion is melting down very fast, notwithstanding the promises of the men to the officers. 13 have been discharged by Colonel Dark today. The 27th of October, gave orders for enlisting the levies with the condition of serving out their time in the present corps. Payomingo arrived in the camp with his warriors. I was so unwell that I could only see him and bid him welcome, but entered on no business. There is considerable dissatisfaction among the levies about their enlistments. The 28th of October, some clothing sent to Fort Washington for the recruits arrived, was begun to be distributed, and will have a good effect. But the enlisting of the levies does not meet with the encouragement that might have been expected. It is not openly complained of by the officers, but it is certainly privately by some of high rank, and the measure of tempting them with warm clothing condemned. Mr. Hodgson writes me that he is sending forward a quantity of woolen overalls and stocks, by General Butler's orders. I have ordered them to be deposited at Fort Jefferson. Some few Indians are about us, probably those the militia fell in with a day or 2 ago. 2 of the levies were fired upon about 3 miles off, 1 killed. 2 of the militia likewise. 1 of them got in, and the other is missing, supposed to be taken. The 29th of October, Payomingo and his people, accompanied by Captain Sparks and 4 good riflemen, gone on a scout. They do not propose to return under 10 days, unless they sooner succeed in taking prisoners. The 30th of October. The army moved about 9 o'clock and with much difficulty made 7 miles, having left a considerable part of the tents by the way. The provision made by the quartermaster was not adequate. 3 days' flour issued to them. The Indian road still with us. The course this day was north 25 degrees west. 31st of October. This morning about 60 of the militia deserted. It was at first reported that one half of them had gone off, and that their design was to plunder the convoys which were upon the road. I detached the 1st Regiment in pursuit of them, with orders to Major Hamtramck to send a sufficient guard back with Benham, a commissary, whenever he met with them, and follow them about 25 miles below Fort Jefferson, or until he met the 2nd convoy, and then return and join the army. Benham arrived last night, and today, November 1st, the army is halted to give the road cutters an opportunity of getting some distance ahead, and that I might write to you. I am this day considerably recovered, and hope that it will turn out what I at first expected it would be. A friendly fit of the gout came to relieve me from every other complaint. With great respect, I have the honor to be, sir, your most obedient servant, Arthur St. Clair. To the Honorable Major General Knox, Secretary of War, Fort Washington, November 9th, 1791. Sir, yesterday afternoon the remains of the army under my command got back to this place, and I have now the painful task to give you an account of as warm and unfortunate an action as almost any that has been fought, in which every corps was engaged and worsted, except the 1st Regiment, that had been detached upon a service I had the honor to inform you of in my last dispatch, and had not joined me. On the 3rd of November the army had reached a creek about 12 yards wide, running to the southward of west, which I believe to have been the River St. Mary, which empties itself into the Miami Lake at the Miami Village, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, having marched near 9 miles, and were immediately encamped upon a very commanding piece of ground, in 2 lines having above-mentioned creek in front. The right wing, composed of Butler's, Clark's, and Patterson's battalions, commanded by Major General Butler, formed the first line, and the left wing consisting of Bettinger's and Gaither's battalions, and the 2nd Regiment commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Clark, formed the second line, with an interval between them of about 70 yards, which was all the ground would allow. The right flank was pretty well secured by the creek, a steep bank, and Faulkner's corps. Some of the cavalry and their pickets covered the left flank. The militia were thrown over the creek and advanced about 1/4 of a mile and encamped in the same order. There were a few Indians who appeared on the opposite side of the creek, but fled with the utmost precipitation on the advance of the militia. At this place, which I judged to be about 15 miles from the Miami Village, I had determined to throw up a slight work, the plan of which was concerted that evening with Major Ferguson, wherein to have deposited the men's knapsacks, and everything else that was not of absolute necessity, and to have moved on to attack the enemy as soon as the 1st Regiment was come up. But they did not permit me to execute either, for on the 4th, about half an hour before sunrise, and when the men had been just dismissed from the parade, for it was a constant practice to have them all under arms a considerable time before daylight, an attack was made upon the militia. Those gave way in a very little time, and rushed into camp through Major Butler's battalion, which together with part of Clark's, threw them into considerable disorder, which notwithstanding the exertions of both, and those officers was never altogether remedied, the Indians following close at their heels. The fire, however, of the first line checked them, but almost instantly a very heavy attack began upon that line, and in a few minutes it was extended to the second line. The great weight of it was placed against the center of each, where the artillery was placed, and from which the men were repeatedly driven with great slaughter. Finding no great effect from our fire, and confusion beginning to spread, from the great number of men who were falling in all quarters, it became necessary to try what could be done by the bayonets. Lieutenant Colonel Dark was accordingly ordered to make a charge with part of the second line, and to turn the left flank of the enemy. This was executed with great spirit. The Indians instantly gave way, and were driven back 300 or 400 yards, but for want of a sufficient number of riflemen to pursue this advantage, they soon returned, and the troops were obliged to give back in their turn. At this moment they had entered our camp by the left flank, having pushed back the troops that were posted there. Another charge was made here by the 2nd Regiment, Butler's and Clark's battalions, with equal effect, and it was repeated several times, and always with success. In all of them many men were lost, and particularly the officers, which with so raw troops was a loss altogether irredeemable. In that attack just spoke of, made by the 2nd Regiment and Butler's battalion, Major Butler was dangerously wounded, and every officer of the 2nd Regiment fell, except 3, one of whom, Mr. Cretan, was shot through the body. Our artillery being now silenced, and all the officers killed except Captain Ford, who was very badly wounded, and more than half of the army fallen, it became necessary to attempt the regaining it, and to make a retreat if possible. To this purpose the remains of the army were formed as well as circumstances would admit, towards the right of the encampment, from which, by way of the 2nd line, another charge was made upon the enemy, as if in design to turn their right flank, but in fact to gain the road. This was effected, and as soon as it was open the militia took along it, followed by the troops, Major Clark with his battalions covering the rear. The retreat in these circumstances was, you may be sure, a very precipitate one. It was in fact a flight. The camp and the artillery were abandoned, but that was unavoidable, for not a horse was left alive to have drawn it off, had it otherwise been practicable. But the most disgraceful part of the business is that the greatest part of the men threw away their arms and accoutrements, even after the pursuit, which continued about 4 miles, had ceased. I found the road strewed with them for many miles, but was not able to remedy it, for having had all my horses killed, and being mounted upon one that could not be pricked out of a walk, I could not get forward myself, and the orders I sent forward, either to halt the front or to prevent the men from parting with their arms, were unattended to. The route continued quite to Fort Jefferson, 29 miles, which was reached a little after sunsetting. The action began about half an hour before sunrise, and the retreat was attempted half an hour after 9 o'clock. I have not yet been able to get the returns of the killed and wounded, but Major General Butler, Lieutenant Colonel Oldham of the militia, Majors Ferguson, Hart, and Clark are among the killed. Colonel Sargent, my Adjutant General, Lieutenant Colonel Dark, Lieutenant Colonel Gibson, Major Butler, and the Viscount Mallardy, who served me as an aide-de-camp, are among the wounded, and a great number of captains and subalterns in both. I have now, sir, finished my melancholy tale, a tale that will be felt sensibly by every one that has sympathy for private distress, or for public misfortune. I have nothing, sir, to lay to the charge of the troops, but their want of discipline, which from the short time they had been in service it was impossible they should have acquired, and which rendered it very difficult, when they were thrown into confusion, to reduce them again to order. And is one reason why the loss has fallen so heavily upon the officers, who did everything in their power to effect it. Neither were my own exertions wanting, but worn down with illness, and suffering under a painful disease, unable either to mount or dismount a horse without assistance. They were not so great as they otherwise would and perhaps ought to have been. The loss, sir, the public has sustained, by the fall of so many brave officers, particularly General Butler and Major Ferguson, cannot be too much regretted. But it is a circumstance that will alleviate the misfortune in some measure that all of them fell most gallantly doing their duty. I have had very particular obligations to many of them, as well as to the survivors, but to none more than to Colonel Sargent. He has discharged the various duties of his office, with zeal, with exactness, and with intelligence, and on all occasions afforded me every assistance in his power, which I have also experienced from my aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Denny, and the Viscount Mallardy, who served with me in that station as a volunteer. With every sentiment of respect and regard, I have the honor to be, sir, your most obedient servant, Arthur St. Clair. So that is the end of General St. Clair's own account of his defeat. One person who fought on the side of the Indians that day was Simon Girty. So to provide another interesting perspective of St. Clair's defeat, more from the Indian side, I am now going to read a section of this book, Simon Girty, The White Savage, by Thomas Boyd. This book was published all the way back in 1928. As you will see, some interesting details were left out of General St. Clair's account. During the spring and the following summer, Simon heard the news from the banks of the Ohio. Down at Fort Washington, General St. Clair, a governor of the Northwest Territory, was sending out troops on short expeditions, and being criticized for not taking the field with a greater force. Immigration was being held up by fear of the Indians, and the men who had invested in and laid out the great tracts of land were not making money from their venture. People generally were of the opinion that the Indians ought to be driven so far up into the Ohio country that they would be unable to strike at the pioneers, but Arthur St. Clair was hardly a warlike soul. Social amenities and a well-filled table were more appealing to his nature than a long journey through forests and swamps, with creeks and rivers that had to be forded or bridged. Also, he was a victim of that prime 18th century complaint, the gout. However, something had to be done, and he, being governor of the territory and commander of the army there, had to do it. From April until September, he was spent in concentrating troops and supplies at Fort Washington. By that time, he had got an army of about 2,300, not counting the militia. He had also got between 50 and 250 women, who were to provide entertainment for the soldiers on the way. They would, of course, slow up the movements of his troops, and he was greatly imperiling their lives by allowing them to go. But if it would make the soldiers and officers any happier to have wives and strumpets along, which it apparently would, he was willing that they should go. In September he moved from Fort Washington to Fort Ludlow, which was 6 miles upward, and from there he advanced along the Great Miami, to the location on which he built Fort Hamilton. Major General Richard Butler, between whom and himself there was a good deal of jealousy, was also along. 44 miles north of Hamilton, he and Butler constructed another fort, which St. Clair called Fort Jefferson. With all of this protection behind him, with the camp women buzzing and gossiping about, and with some soldiers who had rather not have gone, he set out to engage the Indians in the wilderness. It was not long after General St. Clair began cutting his way up into the Indian Territory that the warriors gathered about the lower Maumee heard of his movements. Tecumseh, whose name in the Shawnee's tongue signifies a shooting star, went down swiftly with a small group of braves, and he was soon shadowing the advance guard of the governor's unsuspecting army. And shortly St. Clair's line of march and the approximate number of his men were known at the Miami headquarters. But this time the Indians did not fall back. All along the Maumee the tribes were daubing themselves with war paint and singing old songs of vengeance. Blue Jacket, who was tall and straight, rather dazzling in his crimson coat and red sash, struck the pole for the fierce Shawnees. Little Turtle, lighter-skinned and more contemplative than his fellow leader, called to the Miami warriors. Captain Pipe was ready with a force of Delawares, and Simon Girty, looking like a musical comedy bandit in his bright silk handkerchief fitted over his dark, scarred pole, and a brace of silver-mounted pistols at his sides, prepared to ride at the head of the Wyandots. Altogether there were less than 1,500 men who rode down to meet St. Clair's army, but they went quietly and easily, unhampered by the burdens of the provisions, artillery, and equipment that weighed down the Americans, and required them to cut roads for passage wherever they went. That was the first advantage possessed by the Indians. Another, perhaps equally strong, was that St. Clair, except on one occasion, had no scouting parties in front of his main body. There were also the troublesome women, at least one of whom carried a nursing child at her breast. And to add to St. Clair's handicaps, not all of his men were willing to fight, for at least 200 of them had deserted some days before they struck the Indian country. This curious assemblage of white people, which had come to drive 4 tribes out of the Ohio country, was itself attacked as it lay encamped on the night of November 3rd at a bend of the Wabash River in what became Mercer County, Ohio. St. Clair was surprised. The only warning he had came from the sounds of firing from some volunteer scouting parties, which had gone out during the night, and had a slight brush with an advance party of Indians. A little after daybreak on November 4th, the full attack began. The militia encamped about a quarter of a mile in front of the main army now took the first blow, and promptly fell back over the snow-covered ground and across the creek. Doubtless St. Clair heard them, but he did not see them, For that time he was lying stretched out in the tent, with a sudden and mortifying renewal of the gout. The Indians came howling forward under a shower of shot and arrows. The Wyandots were leading, and Girty was well to the fore. On the heels of the militia they came riding down through the woods, and splashed over the river into the midst of the regulars. Some parts of the American line held, as men, not as military units. Major Jacob Fowler, who was at the battle as a second lieutenant, described the confusion for Cincinnati Advertiser. One of Captain Pyatt's men lay shot through the belly. I saw an Indian behind a small tree not 20 steps off, just outside the regular lines. He was loading his piece, squatting down as much as possible to screen himself. I drew sight at his butt and shot him through. Then Colonel Dart came up through the melee, leading his men to the charge. The Indians were driven by this movement clear out of sight, and the colonel called a halt and rallied his men, who were about 300 in number. As an experienced woodsman and hunter, he was also, he modestly admits, a mere subaltern, but these were democratic days. I claim the privilege of suggesting to the colonel that where we then stood, there being a pile of trees blown out of root, would form an excellent breastwork, being of length sufficient to protect the whole force, and that we might yet need it. I judged by the shouting and firing that the Indians had closed up the gap we had made in charging, and told the colonel so. But though Fowler suggested a charge, and the colonel told him to lead the way, the Indians were so thick we could do nothing with them. It was the flying Wyandots, led by Girty, who were so thick. They pushed through the soldiers' ranks, scattering destruction and driving them towards the baggage trains and the artillery, which were well into the camp. By the time the Wyandots had captured the rolling stock, only 10% of Colonel Dart's men were left standing, but Fowler was still at hand. I had been partially sheltered by a small tree, but a couple of Indians who had taken a larger one both fired at me at once, and feeling the steam of their guns at my belly, I supposed myself cut to pieces, but no harm had been done, and I brought my piece to my side and fired, without aiming at the man who stood his ground. The fellow being so close to me I could hardly miss him. I shot him through the hips, and while he was crawling away on all fours, Colonel Dart, who had dismounted and stood close by me, made at him with his sword, and struck his head off. A little later there was a cry from the neighborhood of the tents. General St. Clair, who had hobbled from his bed and was trying to mount a horse which his orderlies were holding for him, was calling for the troops to charge the road. His adjutant general echoed the command, but the order from St. Clair was not for an attack but for a break to safety. Already men and women were streaming down the freshly cut road, and horses were plunging madly at the whoops and musketry of the onrushing Indians. St. Clair missed the stirrup of the mare he was trying to mount. It ran off, and another, a pack horse, was led up. On its broad back he ambled slowly away from the action. Fowler, however, ran to his relative Captain Pyatt, and told him that the army was broken up and in full retreat. "Don't say so," he replied. "You will discourage my men, and I can't believe it." Soon, however, Captain Pyatt was convinced. The bodies of the dead and dying were around us. Major General Butler's was one, but he was carried into a tent where a surgeon attended to his wounds. And the freshly scalped heads were reeking with smoke, and in the heavy morning frost, looked like so many pumpkins through a cornfield in December. By noon the Indians completely had the field, and went to work with their scalping knives, for the retreating army had made no attempt to take care of the wounded. General Butler was one who had been left behind. He had lain outstretched with a bullet wound while the screaming Indians cut in among the deserted tents of the officers, and the trains of baggage and ammunition which St. Clair's army had hastily abandoned. Helplessly he waited for someone to come. Presently Girty and a Wyandot warrior detached themselves from the looting and scalping melee, and rode up to the general's tent. Girty looked at Butler, whom he did not know, but whose uniform showed him to be of high command, then turned to his Indian companion and observed, "Big, very big, long knife captain." The warrior's tomahawk went up and down. General Butler was dead, and ready to be hacked to pieces. From all over the field where St. Clair's camp had been, came the thud of the tomahawk and the rip of the scalping knife. Horses plunged about without riders, while braves reached out for their bridles. Bewildered cattle ran with swinging heads. Flour, ball, and powder, clothing, and blankets lay scattered everywhere. Down along St. Clair's trace, a few braves followed the retreating army for a dozen or more miles, and one woman, made frantic by the pursuit, flung the child she was carrying into a snow pile, then ran the more swiftly back over the slushy trace towards distant Fort Washington. When the looting and murder was finally over, a deputation of Wyandots, who had been the leaders of the day, came respectfully up to Girty and made a long speech in which they presented him with 3 of the captured cannon. So that's it for this episode about the largest defeat of the U.S. Army by Indians in history. Massie Harbison's husband was wounded but survived this attack. We read about this attack from the letters St. Clair wrote to Secretary of War Henry Knox, which were printed in Massie Harbison's book, and also from this 1928 book about the life of Simon Girty. This latter book claimed that there were lots of women camp followers who came along on this campaign, something that Arthur St. Clair did not mention in his letters, even though he talked extensively about his gout. So what do you think about General St. Clair? Was he a terrible general, or were these troops undisciplined? Let us know in the comments. In the next episode in this series, we will hear about a terrible event that occurred in the spring of the following year, 1792, when Massie Harbison's home was attacked by Indians. This channel is called Unworthy History because we cover actual history that has been cast aside as unworthy to talk about on history channels on TV. But here on this channel, we bring this worthy history back to life by reading directly from old books. If you'd like to support our mission here on this channel, then you can join our Patreon page or become a YouTube channel member. For $5 per month, you will have access to our members-only videos. We actually did a members-only video several months ago about the captivity of Massie Harbison that was based on this book, Incidents of Border Life. In addition to these members-only videos, your contribution will also be recognized at the end of each episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.